All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to our webinar, Classical Homocystinuria, a journey to improve outcomes through newborn screening methodology. On behalf of the HCU Network America and with support from Travere Therapeutics, thank you for joining us today. I am Mark Horson, a biochemical or metabolic geneticist. After my fellowship, I directed the metabolism clinic at Children's Hospital in Boston, then went across town to direct the metabolic service at Tufts Medical Center. I'm currently director of the Physician Support Service and director of education at BMP Genetics, and I am your moderator for this webinar. We have a great group of participants on this webinar. Folks are joining us from 33 different states, a mix of patients, caregivers, newborn screening staff, newborn screening and rare disease advisory council members, state officials, clinicians, and industry. Sharing their stories and expertise today, we have Danae Bartkey, Executive Director of HCU Network America, Rachel and Justin Skeens, caregivers to their son Landon, and Dr. Marzia Pasquale, Medical Director, Biochemical Genetics and Newborn Screening, and Section Chief, Biochemical Genetics at ARUP Laboratories. And speakers, please keep your microphones off when you're not speaking. Thanks. Just to go over some webinar logistics, we have a separate Q&A and chat box. Please use the Q&A function if you want to ask a question. At the end of each presenter, we will take questions and also launch a poll question. We will also be recording this webinar. The recording will be housed as a resource on HCU Network America's YouTube page. All right. So up first is Danae Bartkey, Executive Director of HCU Network America. Danae is also an adult with classical homocystinuria. She was diagnosed at the age of 10 after her younger brother dislocated his lenses. After years of struggling with the diet and feeling isolated, she co-founded HCU Network America, where she now works as the Executive Director. Thanks for talking.
Mark, thank you for the kind introduction. My name is, as Mark said, my name is Danae Bartkey, and I'm the Executive Director of HCU Network America. And I will be sharing a little bit about my personal journey with classical homocystinuria, as well as how that led me to my role within HCU Network America and what are some of our current priorities are, especially centered around newborn screening. If you could advance it to the next slide. So my story begins really before my diagnosis. It starts with my younger brother, Garrett, who is the curly-haired little boy in this picture with the glasses. Garrett was born in December of 1989. He was a month premature, but he was still a very healthy 9-pound baby. And we didn't suspect anything was wrong. He had the newborn screen that was offered here and nothing came back. It was very apparent, though, despite having a healthy birth, that within the first year something was wrong. Garrett missed his first milestone of sitting up, preceded by missing his milestone to crawl and then to walk. And eventually those things did come along. Everything came a good 6 months to a year behind schedule. And so his speech was also delayed. It wasn't until about his 5th birthday, when he was in school, he was on a little rocking chair type thing, and he hit his head on a filing cabinet. And he came home from school that day and noted that he couldn't see. But being his speech was so limited, we didn't really quite understand what that meant. We just had this whiny, complaining 4-year-old that really didn't have much to really go off of. So after 2 weeks, my mom took him to the eye doctor, who then recommended we see an ophthalmologist. And they immediately noted that his lenses had completely dislocated. Garrett then was rushed into emergency eye surgery, where he had both of his lenses removed from his eyes. And had both lenses removed from his eyes. And then in the post-op follow-up, we were told we should go into genetics because they suspected one of two conditions. So in our genetics appointment, they confirmed that Garrett had, they did blood work and then were able to confirm he had homocystinuria. So in the diagnosis period, it took really quick from suspect to diagnosis, but we should have had those red flags flagged earlier through all his delayed milestones. After Garrett was diagnosed officially, then the other 7 of us in our family were not diagnosed, but tested. And I was the only one who then was diagnosed. I had no symptoms at the time. I had pretty much just been progressing as any normal kid. So very different despite the 5-year advantage on him. And so after our diagnosis, we were quickly introduced to the medical low protein diet and formula, and we were really sent on our way to kind of figure things out, which we struggled with tremendously. And so we went about our lives trying to follow the diet. Garrett and I have both suffered from scoliosis, osteoporosis, crippling anxiety and depression issues as a result. Garrett has always, all through elementary school and middle school, had a one-on-one. He still lives at home now as an adult. He will probably never be able to fully live on his own, at least without some assistance. And so when I was in college, I struggled and ended up having a blood clot. And this is kind of where I tell people that it was a blessing. Not many people would consider a blood clot a blessing, but it helped me figure out how to get back on diet and do it correctly. Shortly after, you can go to the next slide. One thing that was lacking from our treatment that we had through teen to early 20s was support. Our parents our mom, I should say, tried to support us the best she could, but not having any background in medical field, low protein diet, for the internet, there wasn't much she could really do for us other than encourage us to take our formula and try to cook foods that we liked. Our clinic never made an attempt to connect us. So after my blood clot 2 weeks later, there was this invitation that arrived in our mailbox to a low protein cooking class, which introduced me to the PKU community here in Illinois. And I quickly gravitated towards them, started attending low protein cooking classes and other educational events. And I finally felt like I had a community that I had desperately needed long before reaching my 20s. It was in this time that I really understood that how much we were lacking as a patient community, and we really needed resources. I saw all the things that had been developed for those with PKU and was honestly quite jealous and frustrated, because it's like, how did we get, at this point, it was the late 2000s, not quite 2010. And how did we get so far without having any type of formal organization? So it was there in my mind. I attended a conference in Denver, Colorado, put on by Colorado Children's. It was the first homocystinuria conference. And there I met our president, Margie McGlynn. You can advance to the next slide. And there was an attempt to put together a group there, but I don't think our lives all lined up accordingly. So in 2015, Margie reached out to me because I was very involved in advocacy at that point with the PKU organization, and said, how would you like to do something actually for HCO? And so I jumped. I had a full-time teaching job. I was the president of the PKU organization of Illinois, but I said, this is what I wanted all along. We need an organization specific for HCU. So we dove into it. We attended a conference that in 2016 in Prague. It was in the International Congress for Inborn Errors in Metabolism. They had a homocystinuria group off of that. And that put the wheels in motion for HCU Network America. Since then, we have had 3 patient conferences, one most recently in June. And really our mission focuses around helping support patients and families, connecting them together, providing them resources, making sure they have access to treatments, clinicians. That's a big one. You think with a diagnosis, you would immediately be given doctors who know what they're doing, but that's not always the case. And then we also influence state and federal policy. So we are heavily involved in lobbying for the Medical Nutrition Equity Act. And of course, why we're here today, newborn screening. And so I think there's one more slide. Thank you. Here we go. So in 2000, we have it in our mission to help improve newborn screening. And so the first step was to kind of assess the landscape. We knew patients have been missed by newborn screening. Either that newborn screening didn't exist at the time of their birth, or there was, and it just didn't have the markers to catch them. And so we first put together a survey, which we sent out to our community to find and identify patients that had been missed. And we'll give you a little bit more detail about that later. And then in 2019, we went before the ACH-DNC committee and gave testimony about the patients who had been missed, gave a little bit personal experience, and then also from that meeting, they charged a committee to look into this further to help get things moving. After that meeting, we then started meeting with newborn screening labs from around the country. And we also started to engage with the CDC on their work to revise newborn screening. That following year, we put together a homocystinuria newborn screening advisory council, and we adopted talking points. And then later that year, we also secured a session at the 2020 APHL Newborn Screening Symposium, which was held virtually because of the pandemic. And then in 2021, we put together a strategic plan, and we started collaborating with Emory on a 2-tier newborn screening pilot that has recently just been postponed until they can find a new lab director to help spearhead that. So there, I think this one is me too. So, and so there's been a lot of people and organizations, both government and nonprofit, that have been of great assistance in this process. HRSA obviously has been behind us with the ACH-DNC and the New Steps committee. And then we have the CDC working on several things as well, which Marzia will share with you later. And then you can see we've been also working on this as well. So it is definitely a collaborative effort, and we really thank you for taking time and listening to the need for our community. I think it goes back to you now, Mark.
Thank you, Danae. Just keep in mind that to write down your questions in the Q&A box. We will have a bit of time after each speaker, and we'll have a formal Q&A session a little bit later in the webinar. So why don't we take this poll right now? Are you aware of patients being missed by newborn screening at birth in your state? So if you can check yes or no. We're just trying to get a sense of who is out there and your experience. Another couple seconds. All right, so here are the results. Are you aware of patients being missed by newborn screening at birth in your state? 35% have said yes, 65% no. That's a significant number of patients being missed. All right, so on to our next presenter, Justin Skeens. Unfortunately, his wife, Rachel, could not be here with us today. Justin and Rachel are parents to their son, Landon Skeens. Landon is 15 years old and was diagnosed with classical homocystinuria at the age of 4. The Skeens family resides in southern West Virginia. Thank you, Justin, for speaking with us today.
Thank you. So Landon was not diagnosed at birth. At that time, they did not have newborn screenings available. Landon's journey to diagnosis was a very long and hard journey. Landon had a normal full-term birth, but he wasn't meeting certain milestones to his peers, and he didn't begin to crawl until after he was 1, and his speech didn't come on till later. So we knew that there was something going on with Landon. We had been through multiple pediatricians in our city and counties, and was not able to get a firm diagnosis from any of them. At some point, Landon basically was put in the autism spectrum. At that point, we were referred to psychological treatments, where they began doing some testing to confirm whether or not Landon may be autistic. At that time, Landon was very weak. He had severe GI issues, sensory issues. He preferred to play alone. He'd done things repetitively. So that was one of the reasons why they did think that he was potentially autistic. We didn't agree with the diagnosis, and we kept seeking out more medical providers. At some point, we were referred to more psychological testing, which they diagnosed Landon as being MR, and again, we as parents just didn't feel that that was the right diagnosis. To the point where we had medical providers tell us that that we just needed to deal with his diagnosis and learn to accept it and cope with it and move on, and to stop coming to their office because there wasn't anything more that they could do for us. The last pediatrician that we were referred to, whenever we met with him, he done some examinations of Landon, and basically told us at that time that he couldn't help Landon, but he knew that if he did not get help soon, that he was probably going to die, and that's when he was referred to Cincinnati Children's Hospital. we went to Cincinnati, and Landon, was almost going to be misdiagnosed there once again. Upon, arriving, they initially wasn't even going to do an examination because they agreed with the diagnosis of mental retardation. There was an initial misdiagnosis, and then we later learned Landon had classical homocystinuria. This was at the age of 4. Landon was about 4.5, so we had a lot of catching up to do at that point. At that point, Landon was 4.5. He was functioning on about a 2-year-old's level. He couldn't do physical activity at all, just because he was so weak. He didn't have the ability to have energy. He remained tired with a lot of his tasks. He would learn a skill only to end up losing that skill. Landon's brain was covered in white matter. They basically described him as looking like someone that had been in a terrible motorcycle crash. And so we begun treatment. At that point, the most challenging thing for us was diet, medicine. There wasn't a whole lot of information about homocystinuria. Danae, her group is obviously changing that landscape and putting information out there and helping people connect and learn together about this disease. But a 4-year-old's diet, it's hard enough to get them to eat chicken nuggets and macaroni and cheese and pizza, only to learn you can't have any of that anymore. He was on a restriction of 3 grams of protein a day. As a 4-year-old, that was very, very difficult. Growing up, what I'll refer to as a normal diet to be taken away from you as a child, it had psychological impact on him. So it's been a challenge. Food has been a huge challenge, for us, because he wasn't introduced to medical foods. Landon, would not eat low protein medical foods. Because he would not eat those foods, we were forced to put in a feeding tube for nutrients and his medications. Landon, since he's, gotten treatment, he has been able to gain a lot of his skills back and catch up with his peers. With treatment, his brain, the white matter on his brain has vanished. Just normal things that we take for granted in normal lives. Whether Landon's going to a birthday party, he can't eat the pizza and cake that the other kids are having. So every event has to be planned around Landon's food, school lunches, and any type of an event that is revolved around food. We have to make sure that Landon's accommodated, and medications. He's currently taking around 90 pills a day. So his diet basically consumes of vegetables and some fruits now, which, if he could have been diagnosed at birth, we could have introduced him to the medical foods that, that are available. And, he probably would have been receptive to those foods. And, now it's been, it's still something that's a journey in our life. It's affected Landon, his confidence level. He has a very low self-esteem. He sometimes reacts in a way that things are his fault, and people are out to get him, and he's bullied, and so the journey's been long. It also, has had an effect on me and his mother. And
1 minute.
Learning, to cope and deal with this disease has been a challenging thing. And Landon still continues to receive therapies. He has been released from physical therapy and speech therapies, but it's an ongoing challenge, and we just continue to battle it every day.
Hey, thank you, Justin. That is a very important presentation on the impact and implications of homocystinuria. So at this point, we'll go to our next poll question. And that poll question is, would you be interested in joining us to advocate for updated screening protocols? And so there is a yes, no, and possibly would need more information. So please choose one. Would you be interested in joining us to advocate for updated screening protocols? Another couple of seconds. Well, thank you very much. 45% of you that would be interested, thank you. And for the ones that need more information, that will be forthcoming. All right, next on the docket, we have Dr. Pasquale is a professor of pathology and the program director of the ACGME accredited fellowship program in clinical biochemical genetics at the University of Utah School of Medicine. She is also section chief and medical director of biochemical genetics at ARUP Laboratories. Dr. Pasquale is board certified in clinical biochemical genetics. She is a member of the Society for Inherited Metabolic Disorders, the American College of Medical Genetics and Genomics, and several other professional societies. Her research interests are newborn screening, disorders of carnitine and creatine metabolism and transport, and lysosomal storage disorders. Thank you, Marzia, for participating today.
Thank you. I want to start my presentation with a little bit of information about classical homocystinuria. Let's go back and remind everybody what is classical homocystinuria. This is an inherited disorder which is caused by deficiency of an enzyme which is called cystathionin beta synthase. This enzyme requires vitamin B6, pyridoxine, to function correctly. The deficiency of this enzyme results in accumulation of methionine and homocysteine. The incidence in the United States, estimated by 10 years of newborn screening with tandem mass spectrometry, has been reported as 1 in 457,000 live births. But the estimated prevalence is higher, is 1 in 200,000 to 1 in 335,000. And this is being conservative. So it's clearly the difference means that we are missing cases when we do newborn screening. It's inherited as an autosomal recessive disorder, and it's diagnosed, hopefully all the patients can be diagnosed through newborn screening. Currently, the marker that's monitored in newborn screening is the amino acid methionine. And confirmatory tests to ascertain the disease are biochemical and molecular. Plasma amino acids will reveal an elevated methionine in the presence of free homocysteine, which is composed of 2 molecules of homocysteine, and markedly elevated total plasma homocysteine. And DNA sequencing can confirm the diagnosis. The therapy consists in a diet, which is a low-protein diet with an amino acid mixture that's lacking methionine to provide all the essential nutrients that patients will need. Therapy also consists in pyridoxine, especially in responsive patients, and betaine and methylfolate and vitamin B12, which are going to favor, especially betaine, the homocysteine remethylation and help reduce the level of homocysteine. Next slide, please. This is the pathway of sulfur amino acid metabolism, and don't worry, I'm not going to go through all of this. We're going to focus today only on the pathway in the central square. And specifically, I just want to show you where the block is in classical homocystinuria. So the block is at this point, and where the enzyme cystathionine beta synthase helps the synthesis of cystathionine by combining homocysteine and serine. So if you have a block here, like what happens in any metabolic block, everything before the block is going to increase. So that's why we have an elevation of homocysteine, and we are going to see an elevation of methionine. Now, methionine is a little bit far from the block, and this is the reason why, especially in patients with B6 responsive homocystinuria, methionine may not be elevated, may not be very high at birth or at the time the first newborn screening is collected. Next slide. So what is the clinical presentation? We have heard from Danae and from Justin about the clinical presentation. And just to summarize, we have an effect on several systems. So the eye patient can present with lens dislocation and or severe myopia. The skeletal system, patients can have scoliosis, osteoporosis, vascular system, thromboembolism, blood clot. And actually, this is really the most concerning and the major cause of early death in untreated individuals. And then the central nervous system, we can have patients with developmental delay. The B6 responsive homocystinuria is characterized by a presentation that's not as severe, is milder than the non-responsive variant. Currently, the majority of the patients of infants identified through newborn screening are B6 non-responsive, and they are characterized by values of methionine that are higher than those that we see in some of the B6 responsive. Complications of homocystinuria, so this clinical presentation that we have discussed, can be prevented by early identification and treatment. Therefore, we need an effective newborn screening that can identify all the patients. Next slide. So how is newborn screening for homocystinuria done? Currently, tandem mass spectrometry is used universally for newborn screening. It's a high throughput method, so it means that you can run many samples in a short period of time, and you can detect multiple analytes at the same time. So amino acid and desocarnitin are detected and quantified, and among the amino acid, methionine is one of them. The sensitivity of a newborn screening for homocystinuria, or in other words, the ability of detecting all the patients with homocystinuria, depends upon the choice of the markers used for newborn screening and the decision limit or cutoff. So which one is the value that we are going to use, we are going to select to identify the samples that need further confirmation. So those infants that are at risk of having a disease because this marker is elevated. So methionine may not be above the cutoff. We don't have a good representation of what the values are for patients with classical homocystinuria at birth. But by using methods, if you are looking at the values of methionine in the unaffected population, you can have an idea, you know, that typically your cutoff, your decision limit should be above around the 99th percentile of the normal population, or around 2.5 multiple of the median, which in the case of methionine might be between 30 and 45 micromole per liter. So methionine may not be above this cutoff in some of these of the patient, again, especially the B6 responsive variant, and therefore homocystinuria may be missed. We can use ratios of analytes. Because the method that's used for newborn screening allows the quantitation of multiple analytes, it's easy to evaluate all of them and to evaluate the ratios that can help in identifying really patients with who have are more likely to have a metabolic block. And the ratio that's used as a secondary marker for homocystinuria is the ratio methionine-phenylalanine. And then, of course, we have the ability of using a second-tier test that can target total homocysteine, which is a much more specific marker for homocystinuria. Next slide. Just want to go back to the prevalence of homocystinuria just to show you that we are really missing cases of homocystinuria by newborn screening. This is from a paper that was published on the Journal of Inherited Metabolic Disorder in 2014. And you can see the prevalence. This was a review of literature and database, and also there are other papers that are looking at public databases, and you can see that patients identified clinically, if you're looking at the prevalence when you consider patients identified clinically, it's higher than the prevalence when you're looking at those identified by newborn screening. Also, if you look at the age of a diagnosis for patients with homocystinuria and you compare it to the age of diagnosis of patients with PKU, you can see the majority of the patients, if not all patients with PKU, are identified at birth or very early in life, but this is not true for patients with homocystinuria. So obviously, we are missing cases, so we need to do something about this. Next slide, please. So I mentioned before that from data collected looking at the unaffected population, we can say that probably a good and effective cutoff for methionine would be between 30 and 45 probably micromole per liter. This slide was kindly provided by Dr. Petridis at the CDC. This histogram represents methionine cutoffs used by US labs and international labs that are participating in the quality assurance program that's run by the CDC. So you can see here that of over 200 laboratories, I think probably more than 50% have used cutoffs for methionine that are greater than 40 micromole per liter. The range of methionine cutoffs in the US is between 40 and 100 micromole per liter. So this is the reason why we are missing cases. The cutoff for methionine is not low enough. Next slide. So how many cases are we missing? These are data from a couple of years ago. And at that point, the cases that were known were at least 21 individuals missed by newborn screening, born in different states. And 14 were in the last 10 years, which is a lot to me. And the age of diagnosis was between 1 and 29 years. What were the symptoms? They brought these patients to medical attention: lens dislocation, stroke, developmental delay. And there was even a child who passed away because of a blood clot. So clearly, again, pretty dramatic consequences that could have been prevented. Next slide. Newborn screening for homocystinuria occurs in every state and territory. All the states are screening for homocystinuria. Homocystinuria is one of the core conditions in the recommended uniform screening panel. Next slide. The methodology for the screening varies, and in this map you can see there are the methods can be a laboratory can use a derivatized or non-derivatized method, and they can use only methionine as a marker or methionine and phenylalanine ratio in addition to methionine. What is interesting here is that there are only a few states that are using the ratio methionine phenylalanine in addition to methionine, and this could be a very good indicator of for homocystinuria. Next slide. There is also a big variability of the platform that are used in terms of instrumentation and reagents used. However, in studies that were published several years ago, Dr. Rinaldo from Mayo had shown that despite these, all of these differences, there was not a huge variability in the values for this for the different analytes. So I think that there could be a uniform approach to newborn screening that can work for all the labs. Next slide. So I mentioned earlier the second-tier test. Second-tier tests are tests that are run on the same sample used for the primary screen, but the targets are different analytes than those detected with the primary screen, and often you use a different methodology. The purpose is really to identify infants at risk of having a metabolic condition, while reducing the number of false positive and reducing also false negative. Because if you have available a second-tier test, you can afford to lower your cutoff, because you can, with the second-tier test, you can get rid of all the false positive. Next slide. So what is the second-tier test for classic homocystinuria? Because elevated methionine can be due to multiple causes other than a metabolic condition, such as prematurity, liver immaturity. In addition to methionine, one should monitor the elevated methionine, the ratio methionine-phenylalanine, and measure total homocysteine. So the second-tier test for classic homocystinuria is really to measure total homocysteine, which currently cannot be done at the time of the primary screen. Next slide. Are second-tier tests effective? So this slide, the table is from a paper that was published a couple of years ago. And this report the experience of a European laboratory and the impact of second-tier testing on false positive and positive predictive value. So in the rectangle, in the orange rectangle, you can see that for homocystinuria, before implementing second-tier testing, there were 12 false positive cases in a 3-year period, in a 6-year period. And after implementing a second-tier testing, the number of false positive cases dropped to 0, with a positive predictive value of 100%, and they detected 2 true positive cases. So yes, second-tier tests are effective in reducing false positive cases. Next slide. In 2019, a paper was published on the Journal of Inherited Metabolic Disorder regarding newborn screening for homocystinuria, and with a recommendation for an effective newborn screening. A major point of this study was that again, number of newborns affected varies widely, from 1 in 1,800 in Qatari to 1 in 64,000 in Europe, 1 in 335,000 worldwide, even though there are cases looking at the US population where the number of patients, the prevalence has been estimated as being quite higher than what we are thinking. Newborn screening using methionine as the primary marker is not effective and does not detect all the patients, especially those with pyridoxine responsive disease. the use of a second-tier test is important and should include total homocysteine and methylmalonic acid. Methylmalonic acid is helpful to identify patients with homocystinuria due to a defect in a different enzyme, in a different pathway. But this will increase the specificity of newborn screening and lower cost, and will enable the identification of infants with homocystinuria as well as infants with the other condition, remethylation, homocysteine remethylation disorder. Next slide. Danae had mentioned that earlier that the CDC is working toward making second-tier tests more available. And in fact, they have developed several assays for the detection of total homocysteine in a blood spot. So they have worked on a second-tier screening assay that multiplex total homocysteine with other second-tier analytes. So this will allow a laboratory to maximize the efficiency and reduce the cost. They have worked on a method that combines a first and second-tier screening analyte. And this has been published actually in Clinical Chemistry. And they are working on multiplexing total homocysteine detection in the first-tier screening by tandem mass spectrometry. This is probably similar to the approach to the detection of tyrosinemia type 1 when everybody realized that tyrosine was not the best marker for tyrosinemia type 1. So the CDC, in addition to working on this method development and validation, they have available samples for quality control and proficiency testing as well for this second-tier testing. Next slide. I think this is it. Yeah. So this, I think, yeah, this, I'd be happy to take any question.
Terrific. Hey, thank you so much, Marzia, for your presentation. Everyone, you see a polling question, or a third and last polling question for you. So if you are representing a lab today, would you be interested in joining a working group to collaborate on screening issues? Yes, no, or possibly, but need more information. Please choose one. If you are representing a laboratory today, would you be interested in joining a working group to collaborate on screening issues? All right, another second. Okay, well, we have over 80% who are either signed on or need more information. So we'll tell you a little bit later about our plans and how to get more information to you. So with this background provided by Danae, Justin, and Marzia, we have begun our community call for action. So any questions or comments that anyone would like to ask at this time? One question that came up was, why is, homocysteine with an E versus homocysteine, which is two homocysteine molecules or free homocysteine. Why is one better than the other? And can you comment on that, Marzia?
Sure. So homocysteine, the dimer, the one formed from two molecules of homocysteine, represent a very small percentage of the total homocysteine. Homocysteine has a group, a chemical group, which is called the sulfhydrylic group, which is very reactive. So it's not present as such, and is combined, is bound to protein, and also forms a dimer. So normally you don't see the dimer, the homocysteine, when you do amino acid analysis, but you can see homocysteine in the amino acid when the concentration of total homocysteine is probably above 80 micromolar or so. And the normal concentration of total homocysteine is up to 12 micromolar. So again, you can see that in amino acid only when it's extremely elevated. Total homocysteine, instead, when you measure total homocysteine, you break down all the bonds and you are measuring all the total homocysteine. So you can have, you can identify patients with homocystinuria who may have not a very high concentration. They may have a concentration high enough to be seen in the amino acid analysis. The other problem with the homocysteine is that depending on how long the sample is stored, it can decrease over time because it binds to protein.
All right, well, one follow-up question to that. Would there be improved detection if the ratio of methionine to phenylalanine was used as the primary marker versus just using methionine alone?
Yes, the recommendation published, they again recommend to use methionine and or methionine phenylalanine ratio. And from my experience, I have seen even with a ratio, with a cutoff that was fairly conservative, was around 40 micromolar. I have seen infant with a normal methionine, so a level of methionine that was less than 40, but an elevated methionine phenylalanine ratio. So I think, again, it just depends on where you select the cutoff for the ratio, of course, but I think that the methionine phenylalanine ratio could be a more sensitive marker as well.
Well, it's also good to know that we're finally sort of prioritizing the fact that homocysteine elevations is really a symptom of more than one disease, not just homocystinuria, but homocystinuria associated with methylmalonic acid. But what would we do for homocystinemia where the methionine level is not elevated, it's actually low, like the remethylation defects?
So you are asking what would we do? This remethylation defect, they need to be detected as well, and they need to be treated as well as soon as possible, because these conditions can have very significant clinical consequences that, of course, we want to prevent. So it would be great to be able to detect them early.
Okay. Thank you. So at this point, we're running a little bit late, so I want to thank our speakers for their presentations. I want to thank you, audience, for your time, for sharing your insights, and for participating in our. We hope you found this webinar and we look forward to continuing this collaboration in the future. We will be reaching out with follow-up communication to inform you of opportunities to get connected and involved. But in the meantime, if you have any questions or want to follow up with one of the speakers, please see Danae's message in the chat box, and her contact information is there. Okay, and just one more comment. New reports show that patients with severe MTHFR deficiency and cobalamin defects, specifically cobalamin G, diagnosed at birth on treatment, have a much better outcome. So this is our clarion call. This is our call the troops. So thank you again for participating. Thank you for showing your passion, and enjoy the rest of the summer.